As I say, I'm a Scotsman. I'm originally from Edinburgh, which is a mortal sin in this city. I've spent a lot of my time with publishers worldwide, mostly, I have to say, newspaper companies, so apologies to the magazine experts in the room. My theme today is small is beautiful. And just a few statistics to kick off. Circulation around the world, very mixed patterns. Newspaper circulations are still rising across the world, but it's largely thanks to Asia, particularly China and India. And in the West and North America, they've declined by about 17% in the last 5 years. Interestingly, readership has declined by about 11%. So circulations are declining faster than readership. Readership is driven by a number of factors. The wealthier the country, it's generally the case, the higher the readership. The United States is an exception. It's the third dot from the right, and you can see it's well below, in red, well below where it should be. And the converse of that is that the number of people reading a copy goes down the wealthier the country, and indeed the wealthier the readership of any particular publication. It tends to be that people in smart houses live in smaller homes, generally. Another thing that's interesting is that we often think of readership as just being a bunch of automatons going out and reading a newspaper, buying a newspaper every day, but that is absolutely not the case. And in fact, there are about 50% more people reading over a week than read on a daily basis, and 75% more over a month. And the biggest cause of decline in circulation is purchase frequency. People are still reading and buying newspapers from time to time, but they buy them less often. And that is a challenge. And the other thing about it is that the richer you are, the less loyal you are to your newspaper. People who read The Sun, the downmarket tabloid here, tend to read about 3.5 to 4 issues a week. People who read The Times, at the other extreme, tend to read about 1.5 issues a week. So the problem you have is the people who most appeal to your advertisers have the lowest levels of readership per copy and the lowest purchase frequency. And this is true in certainly most of the markets that I've looked at. Another thing that's interesting is when you compare the consumption of newspapers with all these other somewhat trendier media, about 2.2 billion people in the world, adults that is, in the world, read a newspaper in either print or digital form. Of them, 500 million, are looking at digital, but of them, only 100 million are reading only about the population of Germany. 100 million are reading only digital. There's something wrong with that slide. The red bit is just digital. But then when you look at people who go on the internet, there's more of them. There's about 2.3 billion. But of them, most of them are still using slow access. The number of people with broadband access around the world is actually relatively small. If you look at the number of people watching television, it's obviously an enormous number, but as you can see, that's people who are reading ever around the world. If you think that here in Scotland, we're selling about 1.5 million copies of newspapers on a day, Newsnight, which is the flagship news programme, which has a Scottish edition, has an audience of 70,000. So it just tells you what's happening. And finally, if you look at mobile, yes, the consumption of, the ownership and usage of mobiles worldwide is enormous, but the number of people who have 3G or above is tiny. It's just over 1 billion. So as an industry that thinks it's very mature, it's 400 odd years old, we're still doing actually rather well, relatively speaking. So over 40% of the world's digital audience read a newspaper online, up from 34% a year ago. But there's a catch. Digital audiences still generate interest rather than intensity. And I've just taken this sample of countries as examples. So in the US, 67%, 2 out of 3 people ever visit a newspaper website. But the number of daily visitors who visit a newspaper website daily is only 17.1%, and the total number of pages consumed is 1.1. And if you look along these other countries, you can see the differences. But in fact, we're getting a tiny, tiny fraction of the digital audience relative to the number of people who are visiting it. And if you look at how this is reflected in spend, this is newspaper advertising in 2007 and 2011. And this is digital advertising in 2007 and 2011. But the difference, the intersection here, which is about 2.1 billion, is what newspapers are making. And that's 2.2% of all press advertising. It's 2.8% of digital, and it's 6.6% of non-search, because obviously such a high proportion of digital advertising is search. So we're making a tiny proportion of our revenue from digital still. And this is what it looks like in terms of the contribution of the 4 channels: digital advertising, digital content, advertising in print in red, and circulation in print. It's counting really just for 2 or 3% of the total. It may account for 10% in the US. We're all told at every event we ever go to about how wonderful Schibsted's digital audience is. It is wonderful, but they're the only company I know of that are making anything like this level of revenue from their digital work in Sweden. And mobile is only 1% of digital. So whilst we're all getting ourselves in a frenzy about our iPhones and iPads, and it seems to me that that's all anybody ever seems to want to talk about, digital on mobile is 1%. Mobile is 1% of all digital, and digital is only 3% or 2% of the total. And it really worries me, I think I mentioned this last year, it really worries me that all the focus, when you go to a lot of events, not this one, I'm pleased to say, but a lot of events are absolutely consumed with what is accounting for 2% of our industry's revenue. And circulation is the biggest source of revenue in the newspaper industry in the world. It's just under 50%. And it seems to me to dying a death among many of the supposed leading thinkers. And we need to, I think, revitalize that activity. So when you then say, well, what's our share of audience? And what's our share of advertising? And what's our share of digital pages and share of digital revenues? In actual fact, the revenues we're making are more than we deserve. Relative to the scale of the audience that we have that I've just shown you, we're actually doing probably 50% better in terms of revenue than the general audience statistics would suggest. So, and I think we have to have that context, and we need to start fighting back for the importance and the value of circulation in the cacophony of the digital world. It's all about frequency, driving the reading multiplier. Okay, we've got to get more people to read. We've got to improve the frequency of reading, and we've got to increase the intensity of pages. The average page of a website, of a newspaper website, that number of pages that are read, I think is about 5.6. So we're not reading anything like the intensity in digital that we do in print. Now here's an interesting slide. I just threw this, and I was talking to this guy during the week, and I just suddenly thought how interesting it is that here's a man using a tablet. And what is interesting about it isn't the tablet, which we all know and love, it's what's around the tablet, because this is the man. And this is in 1994. His name's Roger Fidler. He works at the Reynolds Institute at the University of Missouri. And he first envisioned the tablet and wrote a paper about it in 1981 when he was working for Knight Ridder. And it shows that this idea has been around a long time. And I can remember in the mid-70s, you would go and hear Roger speaking, and then we'd all go to the bar afterwards and say, this guy's obsessed with this thing. Why does he keep talking about it? Does he not have anything else to say? Well, I'll tell you, he was 20 years ahead of his time, 30 years ahead of his time. So if you look at international sales now, I sort of asked around about sales of newspapers in 2007 and magazines in 2012. In Germany, the magazine market, 5.8% of it is overseas, and today it's 5.7%. And the combination of there's been a decline in sale and a slight decline in percentage means overall international magazine sales have fallen by 11.8%. The definition, by the way, of an international magazine is a magazine published in a country that goes into other countries, as opposed to publications like the IHT. In France, it's gone from 5.5%, this is newspapers, to 4.3%, and sales have come down 28%. And in the UK, they're down more dramatically by 48%. But the reason for this, okay, is partly to do with the internet. There's no doubting that. But also in the UK's case is there's been a change in working practice in the way the auditing process works, and that's then reflected in newspapers a change in their distribution practice, because in fact most of them are losing money on international sale. So what are we going to do about all this? Well, content factors are the first thing that I think are interesting. And newspapers are, in my view, far too big. Right? People want a smaller, better package. Isn't it ironic that our most upmarket newspapers have got all these sections in them, masses of sections, particularly on Sundays where there are Sundays published? People, the richer people are, the less time they have to read. So why do we give them maybe 6 times as much content than they read every day? They only read a quarter of the average newspaper. Rich people read a lot less. Right? There's a great deal of emphasis on personal demand because of time pressures, and also people are conscious of the environment. When you look at research, there is definitely a sense that we're wasting trees and all of this. I know it's not true, but it's what the man in the street thinks. And we're seeing format shifts. If I had to choose one newspaper that I really like, it's 20 Minutes in France and Spain, which is A4. The top newspapers in Austria are small as well. So I think this is a concept that really is going to catch on, the idea of a small and smaller newspaper. When you read a book, you start at the beginning and you finish at the end. Right? I don't know if anybody has a different way of reading a novel, but that seems to be. When you watch the news on television, you start at the beginning and you read it to the end. Isn't it funny? With all media, except newspapers, we start at the beginning and we keep going until the end. We don't suddenly phone up the television station and say, look, I'm really sorry, but the newsreader isn't covering what I want them to cover. Can they do something else? Life just doesn't work like that. We accept what they choose to give us. And yet in a newspaper, we give them 4 times more than they want. Now the problem is they all want a different 4%. Right? Because they're a really annoying lot of readers. But what would happen if we produced a newspaper as a book? Right? A news book, a nuke. Start at the beginning, read it to the end. Why don't we do that? Do we not have confidence in our editors? Are we really accepting that such a high proportion of the content is of such importance to so many people? Are we doing it because of editors' egos? You know that the vast majority of quality newspapers lose money. They make more revenue per copy, dramatically more revenue per copy, but they cost exponentially more to create because we have so many more people writing things that people don't read. And if you actually look at a lot of the content that's in the papers, you would dump it tomorrow, except that the editor would burst into tears. Right? But I would think very hard in these difficult economic times, particularly in an international context, about nuking the news and producing a newspaper of fine writing, less of it, that somebody can read in 20 minutes and you have the confidence to put out the very best. And the great thing about the concept is your editorial costs less, and because you're saving money, you can then add more quality writing to the book, which is why the New York Times have tried for a long time to charge simply for all their quality writers. They have some of the best writers in the world, and they want people to pay for that. Okay, I know they've changed their business model now, but it seems to me that that's a very good concept. The other thing about the concept is, given that the newspaper is the most navigable medium, and our eye scans the page in about 0.6 of a second and subconsciously decides what it's going to read, and the same is true for the advertising, why is it that when you take the new concept of navigation and all the power of the internet, do people read so little and for so short a time and so few pages? Why is it that the medium didn't translate to the internet successfully? And it hasn't, right? The figures show that. So, volumes are reducing geometrically. Right? The copies being produced are going down. The advertising volumes are going down. Rates per thousand, of course, are flying up. There's a reduction in publishing frequency. A lot of people are cancelling on a Saturday. There's a shift from daily to weekly. And there's a demonstrable argument for converting from daily to weekly if your advertising volumes are low. There's greater localization. And we're beginning now, at last, to see more tailoring. And this is a long way to go. I was at a lunch today with one of Mark Hollinshead's directors, and we were talking about how even for big mass production newspapers, digital is going to be the solution. And I'm a great fan of digital printing. Technology, waste minimization, more efficient short runs, reduced copy costs, and so on. I think we'll see a merger of newspaper and magazine concepts along the lines of the nuke that I was describing. And as I say, the bigger picture will be smaller. So just a few quick concepts for you, Jim. Versioning. I don't know if you've read I, if you're not from Britain. Make sure you see a copy of I before you leave. It's a cut-down version of The Independent with some different writers and different opinions. It's been fantastically successful. It now sells more than The Independent, and it has every bit as strong a cachet. I think I'm right in saying The Independent sales have come down 40,000, and I's circulation is about 250, 260, something like that. If there's somebody here who knows better, just shout out. But that means then they've increased their circulation by about 220 copies, or nearly doubled their market for a lot less editorial cost because they've reversioned. I drive a Mercedes. The man along the road has a bigger Mercedes, so I hate him. But it comes out the same factory, and most of the components are common. Why can't we do that? Why aren't we versioning our papers? I think it's a cracking idea. If I unfortunately found myself back in a job, I'd even think about it. Ad localizing is another area, and I think there's a great opportunity for you in localizing advertising in your international titles by all working together. And perhaps we see this shift from print to digital, which I know must affect most of the people in this room. You might also think about becoming the distributors of regional advertising, your business model in reverse. So what you do is you take on the role of selling all the newspapers in this room to German advertisers. And then when the German copies go into different countries, you tailor the advertising that way. And if it's German copies that are going into France, you might include advertising from French companies on those pages. Because the majority of the advertising in foreign editions is of little interest to the advertisers when they're abroad. You know, you're not going to respond to most ads when you're not in the country. So why don't you change all of that, but do it all together so you're selling across the country to the industry worldwide? And I think it could be organized fairly quickly. There are sales agents in every country. There are companies like Public Group who could take that role on for the industry. So that's one for you to think about, David. Airline editions. When you walk down an air bridge, you trip over all these papers, half of which are too big to read on a plane anyway. So why aren't we producing a free newspaper for passengers on airlines? They're rich. They can afford to go on planes. You're a captive audience. So why isn't there a British Airways newspaper with a third of the content British Airways propaganda, a third of the content general news, and a third of the content about your destination? So all the British Airways flights going to Germany can have German information in them, and German advertisers, and German tourism, and so on. Cross-title supplements, I've just talked about this concept, but why aren't more newspapers working together? So, for example, all of the French newspapers put into an international edition one supplement for that country. Because you're not, when you're abroad, likely to be buying more than one paper a day. So why don't we have a supplement that goes into Le Monde, Le Figaro, Les Echos, and so on overseas? I think there's a market for international newspapers. We don't have a European paper. And there is a market for it. There is only the IHT, and about 4, which is fantastic. I subscribe to it every day. But it is now it is the international edition of the New York Times. When they split with the Washington Post, they made the conscious change in strategy to go from being a truly international paper to being the international version of the New York Times. And it sells so well in many countries outside the USA, the New York Times is one of the top newspaper websites. You know, and so you have to ask yourself, why is it in a country with a completely different language, so many of the sales are the New York Times? That, if anything says there's a gap for an international newspaper, and if you want to look at this as a concept, look up the European Daily in Google. There is a company, 2 Swedes and a German based in Brussels, absolutely fantastic guys, looking at this, and they contacted me, and I said, oh, this is really good. And I went along to see them, expecting to meet 3 wrinkly old men like me, you know, going in their Zimmer frames and talking about the past and the industry. Not a bit of it. These guys are in their early 30s. And 2 of them were consultants traveling around, and they thought to themselves, how am I traveling all around Europe doing all this work? And there's nothing for me to read. If you're interested in that, either contact these guys direct or come to me and I'll put you in touch with them. Because I think this is a really big, big subject. I'll just leave you with this thought to give you plenty of confidence. Okay, thank you all very much.